right. Hello, everybody. Good morning. So I'm Mickey Morissette, congregant here, but also publisher and editor of Minnesota Women's Press. And we had decided that a good theme for January would be hope and grief. We decided this before the election, but we knew there was a 50-50 chance. So what we did in this issue, and you'll see this, around the building, is we had a lot of different writers share their views on where they feel. Especially, we really wanted to capture the voices of some of the younger generations. I don't know if you consider yourself a younger generation, but from my viewpoint, you are. So what we wanted to do is, the times today are very different than they were even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, really. And so we wanted to capture a lot of those voices of where people are feeling about the state of the world. And these were 3 of the women in the issue who all had really lovely, hopeful, uplifting things to say despite where some things are. So, and that's kind of the point of everything, is we all still have each other to uplift each other, to look ahead with positivity and change. And so that's kind of what this is about. So we invited 3 of them to come to talk today a little bit about what they wrote in the issue. I'm just going to ask each of them a question based on what they've written, and then we're just going to have a little conversation. So first is Cheyenne Wilson, who is the author of We Are the Evidence, a handbook for finding your way after sexual assault. She, by the way, has brought copies of her book, which will be downstairs in the social hall after we talk today. And Cheyenne, you wrote the book because you wanted to bring together the voices of survivors, therapists, dietitians, nurses, detectives, lawyers. And you indicated that you did start to feel hopeful about the future in the process of creating a book, a resource that could help others. You've written, it's a very substantial book, 300 pages, basically, a very comprehensive guide. You wrote in the essay for Women's Press, when I talk with other survivors of sexual assault, I often remind them that healing mirrors the stages of grief because recovering from trauma is, in many ways, a grieving process. We grieve the loss of innocence, who we were before the trauma, the future we envisioned, and sometimes even friends and family who do not offer the support we need. So my question to you, Cheyenne, is it is common for many people who experience trauma, and I was one of those, to try to very quickly push through the pain or numb it. And you indicated that you were yourself in stages of denial because someone you knew assaulted you, rather than the common myth so many of us have had that it tends to be a stranger. You searched for resources to navigate the confusion and questions you experienced, and then decided to create that resource yourself. So, what advice do you have for people who are in the midst of grief related to trauma or loss and are desperately searching for a way out of it?
I want to thank you for that question, and also thank you for inviting me to be here. This is an opportunity to talk about something that is very important to me, because I did spend years denying what had happened, and that ultimately delayed my healing process and my healing journey. Because when we're grieving a trauma, it's very natural to want to run away from that. It's very natural to want to use ways to avoid dealing with it or delaying that healing journey. So I wanted to talk about how when we're stuck in the thick of trauma and grieving, it's natural to want to escape it. But healing happens when we're able to sit with the trauma and the grief and begin to process it. And a great way to start that is to educate yourself. Start looking at resources that are available. Look at the realities of trauma or grief, because it'll help you feel like you're not alone. It'll help you understand what you're going through and why you might be acting and behaving the way you are. But a big piece I also want to share is that healing happens in community. After trauma and loss, it's tempting to isolate. These feel like very isolating experiences where you're on your own, no one's there for you, no one understands what you've gone through. That's natural. I don't want anyone to feel like that's not okay. It's okay to take some time for yourself, but healing really happens in community. And so if the people around you aren't supportive at first, try finding other groups and other communities. There's so much online even. There's entire peer support groups online you can find. Think about your formal and informal supports. So your doctors, your therapists, who in your life can help support you through this. But it's also important for those in your community and those who have a loved one who's been through trauma or loss to educate yourselves as well. Not doing so can make you, without meaning to, cause more harm, as you might ask victim-blaming questions that take the blame and the shame of the trauma from the perpetrator where it belongs to the victim. So educating yourself is a really big step. And keep checking in with your loved one. It's really easy to offer help once and then not offer it again. But a lot of times when you're in that really dark spot of healing and trauma and try and navigate what to do next, it's hard to say yes when someone offers help the first time. So keep offering help. Keep inviting them to engagements, even if they've said no a couple times because they weren't ready. It means the world to them to know that they're thought of. Healing happens as a marathon. It's not a sprint, and that is for the survivor as well as those supporting them. So be present, take care of yourself, because this is a long journey and there's going to be ups and downs. But the sooner you are able to sit with your trauma and start working through it, the sooner your healing can really begin. Otherwise, that trauma just kind of festers and that grief just festers and it'll come up later and later. And this, I think, applies to everyone no matter where they're at in their trauma healing journey, because like I said, I denied it for years. And so I didn't get to really start going through and processing and healing until 3 years after my assault. And that's 3 years of my life that I can't get back. So starting that process sooner rather than later is really important. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just add, I have mentioned this to Cheyenne, but I had myself been sexually assaulted by a coworker in college, at the college newspaper. And because I enjoyed working there and didn't want it to be a thing, I pretended it was not a big deal. And I ignored it and denied it for a couple of years. Again, it was somebody I knew who apologized later, and so I thought, oh, well, then that wasn't what it was. So, but it took about 10 years before I finally got therapy for it and affected a lot of things in my 20s. So I thank you for your book and what it took to put it together. So, Melissa Vasquez, you are the Communications and Community Engagement Manager of Latino Lead. And you had written we have a tapestry section in the magazine which features the voices of a lot of different people expressing a lot of different perspectives. You said there, the future I dream of is one in which we redefine what it means to belong. It's one in which immigrant communities are empowered to build and thrive. I believe we are on the cusp of a cultural renaissance that embraces the full complexity of our identities and celebrates our presence as an integral part of this nation's fabric. And, we talk at First Unitarian Society here about the differences between seeing the world with love and fear and hope amidst the grief and the inevitable spectrum of feelings that are between those emotions. And we've also talked here about the threats of massive deportations this year. Yet your thoughts are hopeful about belonging and thriving and building and creating together and enabling people to recognize and celebrate complex identities in this country. In the work that you do, why do you see this optimism about a coming renaissance?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Cheyenne and Mickey, for sharing your stories and your powerful words. And I appreciate this question. I hope you don't mind if I've prepared a few words in advance. It's true that we live in a time where fear can feel overwhelming. Fear of deportations, of losing rights, of seeing our communities further marginalized. But I believe that hope is not the absence of fear completely. It's what rises in response to it. My optimism about a cultural renaissance comes from the way I've seen communities like mine refuse to let fear define us. As a DACA recipient myself and the daughter of Mexican immigrants, my existence is shaped by both grief and hope. I've witnessed the pain of uncertainty and the resilience this experience demands, but through my work at Latino Lead, I've also witnessed a powerful shift. Latina leaders, advocates, and other community influencers are no longer asking for permission to exist or to belong. We are building spaces where we can thrive on our own terms, and that is the foundation of my hope. I see this renaissance in the young people who are rewriting the narrative of what it means to be American, not to do away with what currently and beautifully exists, but to further accentuate our roots and our dualities. I see it in the growing recognition that our stories are essential to this country's future. And I see it in the partnerships and solidarities across communities, which are very evident here at FUS, which remind me that our struggles are interconnected, but so are our victories. This optimism doesn't come from ignoring the grief or the challenges. It comes from embracing the complexities of our experiences. Grief tells us what we've lost, but hope tells us what's still possible. And in the Latina community, we carry both, along with a deep understanding that joy and celebration are forms of resistance in and of themselves. The Renaissance, I imagine, is one where we are not only surviving, but thriving, where our cultures are celebrated and our contributions recognized. It's fueled by the belief that our identities are not deficits, but strengths. And when I think of the future, I don't just see the obstacles ahead. I see the generations of leaders, dreamers, and change makers rising to meet them. That's why I choose to see the world with love, because love propels us to act, to build, and to create a world where we all belong. And that's what I've had to share today.
So Priscilla, Trin, and I go back years now. She's been writing with Women's Press, she's on our editorial board for several years. So I've always very much appreciated having her voice connected with what we're doing, and she's a big supporter, which is very helpful. You wrote a story in this issue about the solidarity economy, highlighting that you feel hopeful seeing efforts to support unhoused people at encampments, the creation of community-owned renewable energy, Native women establishing hydroponic food sovereignty, and other things. You said, quote, "All these actions indicate a cultural shift from individual efforts to community-oriented solidarity. By centering the collective and developing communal structures rooted in shared resources, we are developing a more inclusive economy with self-governance." So similar to Melissa, you see reason for optimism that we are shifting to a kind of cultural renaissance that is more collective and communal than what we have experienced for decades, probably since we started living in individual homes in an industrialized and capitalistic society. So my question to you is, how do you see this community-oriented shift happening and unfolding across urban, suburban, and rural areas?
Thank you, Mickey, for that question, and thank you for having us, really, at FUS community. I mean, as an ex-Catholic, this is actually quite healing just to be here and experience this type of service. So I guess to answer your question, Mickey, I work in my 9-to-5 in food systems. I don't have a communications degree, but here I am being director of communications manager, and this role has really provided me hope because I've always thought that STEM, which is what I love, but I'm not good at it, but the reason why you need communicators is that they can do this bridging, showing how there is progress being made, because I think sometimes a lot of our successes are kept in academic fields or in the political field, and I have a lot of hope because I'm seeing, as an immigrant daughter, as someone who has encountered essay, as someone who has multiple identities, we are seeing the pinch affect everyone. It's not the first time we've been in a recession. It's not the first time we've had socio-political unrest. But I really think along the spectrum, a lot more people are unhappy and they're more vocal about it. especially since COVID. I graduated on the tail of COVID, and coming out of that, I felt on online spaces and in leftist spaces where I occupy and spend a lot of my time, there's this unifying recognition that it's not just money, it's also social fabrics that need tending to, it's also health fabrics that need tending to. And so the narrative is shifting. I think people are making the dots and connections a bit more. And I talk to people who are right of center and try to communicate their viewpoints, and they say very similar things, just with different words. And I think that's what gives me hope, is that you see this narrative merging. People are feeling the injustice affect them. I think there have been walls of privilege that have existed for a long, long time, and now it's starting to come down a little bit. No matter what your identity is, I'm seeing people bond over struggles and bond over hope. I think I talk about deep time in my article, and of course it's normal to have reactionary movements. People will say, oh, it's gonna suck. But then you step back and you say, well, it's 4 years in the grand scheme of things. And I talk to intergenerational and have intergenerational conversations. Folks are like, oh yeah, this has been going on for 20 years. You'll be fine, you know? And so, yeah, I think folks are more open about the victories and the struggles and really having this long-term mindset. And that's what gives me hope. Because I'm in my mid-20s, and I always come back to this quote of, hope is not mine to lose. It really is something that all of us are involved in, no matter if we feel it all the time. So those are my thoughts for now.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask all of you a question that we didn't prep, and it's not an easy question to answer, but you know, we pin our hopes on the young, so I'm going to throw this to you. So, you know, one of this long series that we're doing with Women's Press Online is called Collective Health, and that's exactly what all of you are talking about. It's this idea of becoming much more communal rather than relying on individuals to heal themselves, being able to tap into the collective power around mental health and housing needs, related to gender-based violence and assault, related to the way we run our economies and our ecosystems, and being able to turn that tide so that we're less, again, isolated in our spaces, protective in our spaces, and get a better sense of collectiveness and that we're all in this together. But we also know that that's not been an easy transition for people to make, that there's still sort of a cultish desire to feel like this person's gonna fix everything. This spirit sometimes will lead the way. And I am wondering if each of you can just try to talk about in the people that you've connected with, and the fact that there is fear and grief in a lot of ways, but what is it that you think has prevented us from being able to be as communal as all of you are talking about? What's getting in the way? What are the obstacles that we have to deal with? An impossible question to answer, I recognize, but I am just curious to see what each of you has to say about what's blocking so many people from getting a better sense of the fact that we are all interconnected. And then Priscilla, if you want to start, and then we'll just hand the mic down. Thank you.
Happy to start. This is the Friday night conversations I have with my friends. I always come back to this. I think it has to do with our cultural psychology. We talked about healing today, and I think the healing process starts individually and then it ripples out to the community. We don't have in our public education system, at least the one that I experienced, space to talk about mental health, to talk about how patriarchy affects all of us, not just women, men, everyone. And this healing needs to happen first before we can even tackle the greater challenges of our time. Because having the language to connect to each other as humans, having the emotional maturity to hold space for someone that's different, That's not something that was taught in school to me. That is something I was taught through organizing, through being in community with people who did not look like me. And so this deep psychological, cultural undoing, I think, is necessary before we step into working together. And safety. Everyone just wants to feel safe. Folks are afraid of change because they're afraid of uncertainty. And so when you have that safety net, I think that really paves the way for cooperation and collaboration that is healthy. I mean, it's not perfect, but at least you have the tools, the facilitation, the governance, skill sets to navigate those challenges together. And I see that a lot with my brother, who's only 2 years younger than me. And most days I feel like his mom, but I know I'm his older sister. And it's great to see this changing way of friendship. Friendship, I think, is a great thing. Camaraderie comes out of friendships. And my brother, he's always like, ugh, am I gay for talking about my feelings? I'm like, no. So I think it's like a lot of undoing, a lot of unlearning, but I think that's really that individual deep conditioning. Once we undo a bit of that, then it unravels to something much more beautiful and messy and tangled, but at least you're not doing it by yourself.
And yeah, go ahead, Melissa. I'll just interject. My son, who was home for the holidays, had a New Year's Eve party with a lot of his buddies from high school days. And yeah, the conversations that they were having, the kind of party it was, for one thing, so different from when I was that age. And I was, they're remarkable young men, and it's been great to see that those kinds of friendships are out there. And again, we hope we have more of that support for each other, for men that are talking about feelings, for men that are talking about respect, and we do need a lot more of that too. Not to just pin it all on the men. Sorry.
Yeah, I'd just like to extend a eldest sibling fist bump to you. I'm in the same boat with you here. But in this sense, I think that biculturalism and multiculturalism in general is a superpower. Because just innately, you're used to shifting from community to community and just code switch in that way, and becoming accustomed to speaking with and learning from different communities. And I think that's how bridges are established and kept. So I think it's, at least among my peers, it's not just about establishing those bridges, but also learning how to maintain them and reaching across several divides that exist, right? And I think there's a different kind of class consciousness that comes out of that. And I celebrate it every time that I encounter it. Not because of its absence in older generations, but I think we have to keep riding this momentum. Yeah.
Thank you. And then Cheyenne, what thoughts do you have to share?
I think it continues building off what you both have already said, is we have to help people see the value in community. And I think, again, trauma, grief, healing all seems like it needs to be so isolated, but that's where sharing our stories and raising awareness really comes into play, because when you think, oh, I don't need to worry about that type of trauma because I'm a man, I'm this population, you don't think you need to care about it. But then when you learn the realities of sexual assault, as the example, you realize that there are people in your life who have been impacted, and maybe you've been impacted, but you've denied it because you bought into myths about the realities of, or the stigmas that we hear about different traumas. So raising awareness in general, I think, is going to help bridge those gaps, and I think that applies for cities and rural areas, because we need to get the information out there to everyone, and that's a really great way to start building more of a community feel when you get buy-in from everyone that there's a reason to care about this issue. When people feel they don't have a reason to care, they're not going to get as involved.
Well, I want to just thank all three of you for making the trip in today for this. And we're going to step down.